Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and in today's session, we're going to be continuing the HIVE CMS Admin Learning Series, discussing in detail, in very deep detail, the settings that control the CMS and what all those settings do. We want you to know exactly what you can configure, how to configure it, what those settings mean. Now, as always, of course, these webinars are recorded. And for those of you who participate live with us in the main event while we are, kind of presenting this here, we also always have the questions window open. So if you have questions about a particular setting that I'm talking about, want more detail about what the change of that setting might mean, certainly throw those in the questions window. And I try to answer questions live while I'm talking about the topic. But of course, I also save a QA session for the end. But without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at today's topic in detail. So here's the truth of it, right? As an admin, you need to be able to control how the tool system works. And in this case, talking about the CMS, we want to make sure we're controlling how that CMS works for your entire team. And so having these settings kind of misconfigured can really give the team sort of a non-optimal experience. And our goal here is to really make sure that your designers get the best possible experience within HIVE so that they're really kind of seeing the return on the investment you've made and, with your time and also with the corporate finances to purchase the tool in the first place. Now, I think that our defaults are pretty decent, but it might not be exactly what you want, and that's totally cool. Because in this webinar, I'm going to basically outline every single HIVE CMS setting. We're going to go over in super detail, like what it means and what it does to HIVE, so you have a really solid understanding. And like I said, again, if you have any questions about these settings, I encourage you to throw them in the questions window. Also, if you have questions about specific settings that maybe you want that we don't have, throw those in the questions window too, because if you want something, then all of our features are improved based on your feedback. So let us know what it is you're thinking as well. So we're going to kind of cover 4 major aspects today in this webinar. I'm going to show you where to get access to the HIVE CMS settings in the control panel. We're going to take a look specifically first at user settings, the default user settings for when new users get created. And then, of course, users can control their own settings. We've got a pre-recorded webinar on how end users can actually work with their own settings in the HIVE CMS User Learning Series. We're also going to take a look at organization-wide settings and what changing those settings means. We'll also talk about what changing those settings after you've been using HIVE for a while might mean, because many of these, it's okay to change your mind whenever you want to, but sometimes it's good to have a good quality setting put in place early on. We'll talk about that. And then finally, we're going to configure some of these settings. We're going to save them and really kind of make sure that everything works well the way you want it. Now, I'm going to be going through all of this live. None of this is sort of a video that's recorded. I like to go through things live. And if you are a HIVE admin, I encourage you to follow along. Now, to follow along, you're going to need to be able to sign in to our web portal. And that web portal you're going to find on ctcsoftware.com. Technically, you can use your smartphone, you can use a tablet, you can use your kid's Chromebook. But it's usually best on a PC kind of web browser. But it doesn't really matter. Any of these web browsers can leverage this portal because it's basically just a web page that's controlling your settings. So first, let's go find these CMS settings live in the portal. How do we get there? Well, I'm going to pull up a web browser here, and you'll notice that I'm already on ctcsoftware.com right here. What I'm going to do is go over to the little person here to the far right, and I'm going to go sign in. Now, technically, I'm already signed in, and if you weren't, when you click on this, it would bring you to a login page where you'd need to authenticate with your credentials. Go ahead and do that, and that'll bring you directly to the dashboard, your dashboard for your login. In my case, I'm signed into my little Express Tools sort of fake company here, the one that I use for demonstrations. So you can see exactly how this will kind of feel and look for you while you're going through these settings. Now, the first place that we're going to go to get to these settings is the CMS main tab here. Since we're talking about adminning the CMS, this, of course, is where we're going to spend the vast majority of our time. And we're going to be spending most of our time here today, or all of our time today, in this settings subsection. There's a little drawer inside of here that talks about organization settings and user settings. And that's actually where we're going to start. We're going to start talking about the default user settings and what that kind of means for an end user. Now, all of these settings in the user area, end users can change for themselves after they sign into Hive. But if you're inviting a bunch of new users for your company into Hive and you want them to have some basic defaults that you feel are good, then this is the area that you want to be taking a look at. These are settings that once the user's created, you as admins will have no control over because the user may have changed them. They'll have their own specific user settings. So we're going to go take a look at those settings. First here, I'm going to click to the user settings right down here inside the CMS. So once again, I went to CMS, I went to settings, and now I'm in the user subdrawer there. Now for these settings, there's a few things that, I think kind of matter a bit. One that I like to establish over here right away is the log frequency. Now by default, this is set to errors only, and for most companies that's fine. But if you find that you have new users when they jump in to Hive for some reason in your environment, maybe on a virtual machine or something different than perhaps what we've tested or what we've seen in the past, maybe they're getting some squirrely stuff going on. And maybe just seeing the errors might not be enough. And so what I like to do is I like to do verbose warning for our logging for all of my users. And I just set that right up front as the default. And that way, if a user ends up having troubles when they're signing in for some reason in some environments on some operating systems with new updates from Autodesk, like whatever that might be, I don't have to worry about missing what that error or warning or whatever is. I have this verbose log that I know Hive is creating. So I choose to just always have the log frequency be verbose. The Hive cleans up its logs itself. You don't have to worry about that. But at least I've got that verbose log. Personal preference. Now, you may want to default to have all of your users, especially your end users, not be notified when Hive updates become available, especially if you want to control the rollout of Hive across your firm and you have IT who's building those deployments and installing that. Totally understood, totally acceptable, totally expected in many cases. You probably don't want every single user being notified when updates are available. Now, again, a specific end user can always choose to be notified. I do this as an admin always. I tend to turn that on for myself so that I can see. You'll probably want all of your Hive CMS administrators, maybe PAL administrators, being able to be notified when there's an update so you can all have conversations about it. But by default, most of my end users, I probably don't want them to be notified. So I turn that off. Choice for you. Down below here, there's a default to choose whether or not to display the Revit-specific type selector when loading a Revit family. So when they double-click on a Revit family that has multiple types, Hive has the option to pop up a dialog to allow them to select which types it is they want to load. And that type selector will pop up whether or not there is a type catalog associated to Revit content. Again, this is a Revit-specific setting. And by default, I personally prefer to have this enabled. I like to see that type selector. I like all of my users to see the type selector. And if for some reason they decide they don't want to see it, that is understood, but they can make the choice to disable it and also turn it back on again in the future if they need to. So I choose to have this type selector option turned on if I'm working in the Revit environment. If you're an AutoCAD user talking about this, or you're using this outside the Revit ecosystem, then this setting means nothing for you or your end users because you're not using it with Revit. But for those of you in Revit, then definitely you'll want to make sure you consider this, whether or not you want that type selector to pop up. Now, if you don't show this, if you have this unchecked, and there's a family that has types that's double-clicked on, what Hive will do is automatically load all types. That's fine if there's 3, 5, 10 types, no big deal. But when there's, say, structural families that sometimes have hundreds upon hundreds of types, you may not want it forcibly loading hundreds of types. And so that's why I tend to leave this on. The user can always choose load all types in the dialog. There's an option for that. But if the dialog doesn't show, they can't choose not to load all types. So personal preference. But again, the setting is here for you to know how to control it. By default, when users first get an account created, this will be the default setting. The next option here is the number of items that can be displayed per page. Now, this one here is different per organization. It really depends on your libraries. I kind of prefer having 100 items display per page. Just means that I'm not scrolling and waiting for the refresh, the recache of the next whatever that number is. If you have really detailed preview images and you're seeing that Hive responds a bit too slowly for your liking, well, maybe you want it only to retrieve 50 items at a time. Maybe you only want it to retrieve 25 items at a time. I believe the default is 25 or 50. I can't recall exactly which is which, but a lot of my customers like to show 100 per page, so you can certainly change that by default. And of course, you and your end users can modify this specifically for whatever it is they want, but this is the default. And you can also choose a preview image size. I don't remember what the default is. It might be 150. I think the max is 300. The smallest is 100. So you can do anything within that size range. This preview image size really doesn't matter because I tend to change it depending on what I'm doing that day and kind of what view is most relevant to me. But this is just a default in case you want to control this. I think for my preferences, the approximate size that looks good is about 134, give or take. So it's just a number. It doesn't really matter, I don't think. So if you do make changes here, like I have just now with this notify if user updates are available on login, you can save right here, or you need to save here so that that actually locks in those settings for your organization for user settings. So there's not a lot of user settings sitting inside of here, but those that do sit here when you do update them, brand new user accounts that get created for your organization will take on these settings and use them. Okay, so let's talk about the next major section here, which is the organization-wide settings. These are things that affect all users 100% of the time. When you change them, these settings change for all users 100% of the time. So these ones are found underneath Settings, Organization right here. These settings, again, by default, I feel are pretty decent, but you might want to change them, and you certainly will want to update these for how your firm wants to work. Now, there's a lot of settings here, and I'm going to go over each and every one of these. Hopefully, it's not too boring, but I do want to make sure you know what every single one of these checkboxes means, so you know whether you want it enabled or disabled, and when. Now, one thing that I do want to point out, for those of you working with Hive, the CMS, you certainly will want to always try, I think, to be on the latest version. So the latest installer is always available down here at the bottom right. You can get this. You can simply download the Hive, set up and install the Hive CMS whenever is appropriate. That will always be there, so just leverage that. We're also adding another downloads location to get you access to all the rest of CTC's tools, but for now, the best place to go for the CMS specifically is that little downloads link. All right, now let's take a look here at the organization-wide settings here. Notify if a software update is available is sort of like that user-specific setting that was over on the Users Sub-Settings tab. But this one here is a true force for the entire organization. If you don't want anybody in-house, including yourself, ever to see a notification when the Hive is updated, you can turn this option off. It doesn't matter what the user chooses, they won't be notified if this is turned off. Now, I like having the option to get notifications enabled, so that's what this is. It's enabling the option, and then the user settings default has it off for most users, and then your admins or whomever can turn that option on for themselves. But if you're like, you know what, no, I don't want anybody to ever be notified, I don't want to know, I don't want anybody to know, you can simply uncheck this box, and that'll turn off the notifications across the board. I'm going to leave it on. I like knowing when updates come out because it lets me then prepare appropriately. So I'm going to leave this enabled, and of course, my user profile also tells me when updates are available. To the right over here, there's another option. It is Enable Content Requests. Now, the content requests, what this is actually, let me just show it here. I'm going to pull open Hive, the CMS itself, so we can see exactly what this particular option means. There's a button inside the Hive CMS just to the left over here once it signs me on to determine what my interaction level with this is and checking my setting. Right there, there it is, the add request button. The checkbox that's sitting right here, enable content requests, if I uncheck it and save, the next time I open the CMS, this option will not exist. It won't be on the Hive side toolbar at all. If you leave it checked, then the button shows up over here for all users. It's 100% across the board. So in the requests URL right here, this is one thing that for those of you who have an internal requesting system already, I've seen a number of you turn this off because you're like, well, I don't want my end users logging requests to the Hive request system. I want them logging it to my own internal support system. Maybe you're using Zendesk. Maybe you're using, I don't know, issuetracker.com. Maybe you're using, I don't know, Salesforce. Whatever you're using, you want it to go to your support URL. Fantastic. Just enter it right here. If you put in the URL to your internal support system, when a user clicks the add request button, then it will go to the URL that you pick. Now, if you don't put anything, the default is it's going to go to the Hive request system here on the portal, and users can log requests, and it has a communication system. Now, we've got a whole webinar that talks specifically about working with Hive requests, and I would encourage you as admins to go take a look at that. But you can control, if you want users to go to your own internal system very easily, the button can exist, and you can change the destination by simply entering your own custom URL here. So that's what these two options do. One shows or doesn't show the in Hive CMS button, and the other one changes the destination when they click the button where it can go. Nothing means it goes to us. That's the default. Of course, if you're making any changes inside of here, it is important that at the bottom right down here, you hit save so that it locks those changes in. If I'm making a couple of changes and thinking about stuff, I always like to hit save while I'm going through to let it actually lock those in so that my changes get in as soon as possible. I don't forget, I don't leave, the page refreshes, whatever. I like to, when I make a change, save it personally. Okay, let's talk about caching and logging settings. So we were talking about logging earlier on the user area, like how much to log, whether it's just errors, errors and warnings, or a very verbose logging system. The log location here, I'm kind of skipping the cache location, I'll come back to that. The logging location here by default is the user's app data. There's a CTC subfolder, Hive logs specifically. Those log files automatically get deleted after some time frame here, and that time frame by default is 30 days. More than what I think you need. If you wanted to cut that down and say delete after 2 weeks, you absolutely can. I mean, these files are tiny, so it doesn't really matter if you delete them super frequently because they're so small, but some companies like this to be a bit more cleaned up, especially since this is in the app data area, which typically goes to the user's roaming profile. So you might not want all those files in there. You can delete this more frequently. But at least if the user has a problem, you have a log location that you can go to on their workstation or on their instance to go figure out what went wrong. And if you have the verbose logging turned on, well, then you'll know exactly what went wrong and what went right. And you can also communicate that with us. So this is where you're going to find those log locations. Now, if you change this to some other location, maybe you want this to go to your app instead of the CTC Hive logging, you can change that. You can set this to whatever you'd like it to be. And this changes it for all users across the board. Above that, there is a cache location right here. This cache, when a user goes and grabs some piece of content, say I go grab my templates here that are available to me. When I double click on any one of these, Hive is going to create a copy of that. It's going to cache it to my local computer. So if I use this file regularly, the first time I grab it, especially if it's a bigger file, it might take it a second because it has to cache that from the cloud. This, by the way, really only comes into effect if you're using the Hive's cloud caching, but we'll talk about that in a minute too. If you are using the Hive cloud caching, then when a user grabs a file in Hive and double clicks on it, it will cache it locally before it actually consumes it in whatever their design app is, whether that design app is SketchUp or Revit or AutoCAD, Photoshop, doesn't matter. Whatever the design app is, it'll cache it locally first, and it caches it to this location, the app data, again, behind the user's profile, CTC Hive content cache. This also automatically cleans up after itself, because you certainly wouldn't want, terabytes of data being cached locally and always just staying there. Not that your content is that big, hopefully, but it's good to clean up after yourself. And so the Hive automatically, when it opens, it checks to see if there's anything that's old that hasn't been used in a while, and by default, it automatically cleans up after itself every 30 days, or after 30 days of no use. So when a user grabs that file, double clicks on it, it'll cache it, and then it refreshes the dates. Even though it doesn't have to recache the entirety of the file, it'll refresh it, but anything that hasn't been touched in 30 days automatically gets deleted. So that way, it keeps the end user's app data nice, neat, and clean, but still has for them the things they use on a regular basis. Hive the CMS also automatically, when I double click on something, checks to see if what's in the cloud is newer than what I have cached locally. And if it is, it will recache that locally and replace the file 100% that was in my local content cache. Once again, it's this content cache here. And then again, if I don't use it regularly, it'll clean up after itself after 30 days. All right. So those are the two file locations that Hive uses locally. Again, you can control that. You can tell how frequently, if it cleans up, and if it does clean up, how frequently. So let's continue on. Early on, as admins, there's some things that I think you should set up right away and put in place right away. There's some really important ones over here in the actual content settings for when you're processing content up into Hive. There's also some settings as they relate directly to your libraries that you're going to want to make sure you take a look at. Let's first start on the right side over here, the content settings. Now, there's a couple of roles in your Hive libraries. When you're up here setting up and managing your libraries, you can choose how interactive users get with the library content itself. You can make them just what's called a consumer, which basically means they can find the library and they can find the content in the library and they can load it, they can use it or consume that content. And that's it. That's all they can do. There's another role right above that that's called a contributor. And there's two sub-controls you have about how contributors can interact with content stored in libraries. The first one is right here. Do you want to allow contributor-level users on a particular library to add their comments and ratings to that library? If you mark somebody as a contributor, what does that mean? Can they actually rate and comment on content in a library? Now, for me, that's one of the key things that I like my contributors to be able to do, is to actually rate and comment. Some of my customers don't really like the rating commenting system, or they don't use it. They don't find that their users are leveraging it, so they turn it off so that the user interface for the end user doesn't present the option in the first place. And you may choose to do that, but that setting is controlled right here. When you change this, it will change the contributor level rights across the entire organization for you and pretty much immediately take effect. The other option here for contributors is to allow contributors to assign tagging. Now, this is the one that I see most commonly interacted with for you as admins. You may very well want users, contributor level users, to comment and rate content, but you may not want them touching your tags. And so you can certainly turn that option off, which will disable them on the right-click menu in Hive here. There's a right-click option that will let them manage tags, assigning and removing tags. Now, that management or that assignment does not mean the creation of tags here in the portal. We have a specific webinar that talks about tag creation. It's a management level thing, so it's in the Hive CMS Admin Learning Series. We've already talked about that in the past. You can certainly author tags, but you may not want your end users authoring tags. And so, this option here does not allow for that. All this lets them do is effectively go through the exercise of assigning or removing tags within the Hive CMS environment. Now, I personally like this, which is why I have it turned on. I like my contributors being able to comment and rate, and I like them having the ability to assist me in the tagging of content, the subjective tagging of content. But again, if you don't like that, you can turn it off. So if you turn both of these off, what does that mean? Well, that basically means that a contributor level user is the same exact thing as a consumer level user, because the only thing contributors can add is either their comments and ratings or the ability to manipulate tagging. So if both of these are turned off, you basically have a consumer. So I wouldn't turn this off, and I would just tell, the library setting, if I want them to not be able to do these things, one or both, I would make them a consumer level. But if you make them contributor, I would let them do at least one of these things. Up to you how you want to set it up, of course. The next setting down here is really important for you as admins to kind of think about before you start major content processing. And that is this option here, to allow cloud content caching as a whole across the entirety of Hive. Now, if this is turned off, it actually has two sub options right here, which is prefer cloud and allow downloads. We're going to take a look at those in a minute here. But if this is turned off, and if you go through and process 4,000 items into Hive and later say, you know what, I really want that content available to the cloud, and you turn this back on, well, you have to reprocess your content for Hive to actually cache it in the cloud. So think about this before you start the major content processing, right? If this is turned on, you still have at the library level, library by library, the ability to say, for this library, don't cache content in the cloud. And so then maybe you have a special customer who does not allow their content to be cloud stored, but the vast majority of your standards you want to be cloud stored. Fantastic, or cloud cached, I should say. There's a copy of it in the cloud. You can go to that one customer library and say, it doesn't cloud cache. But if you uncheck this as a whole, well, then none of your libraries can cloud cache. It won't even present the option. It'll just not be turned on. I like to have this turned on, and I also like to use the sub option here of preferring cloud content. So when a user grabs a piece of content, it actually tries to go to the cloud location first if it's available, and if it can't find it because maybe it's in a library that doesn't cloud cache, well, then it'll go to the local path on your local network, wherever that happens to be. There's a sub option here that when we first got to this page, I had unchecked, and I did that on purpose. There's this allow downloads option. If this is checked, then within the Hive CMS, when a user right-clicks on a piece of content, there will be an option in here that says download, and they can actually explicitly download a particular piece of content. I don't like that option, which is why I had it disabled. I believe the default is that it is turned on. I don't like it myself because I don't like when users create silos of their own content. The whole purpose for me having them using the Hive CMS is so that they go to this as a central repository for all content. And so I don't like they can right-click and download out of here. So I personally turn that option off, allow downloads, and it does it for everybody. It's not for some users and not others. This is an everybody thing. Even my admins can't right-click download directly from Hive. Now, certainly admins and end users for that matter can still right-click and open content. Of course, they can load content. If we're talking about Revit in this case, they could load it into a project and then open and edit it out of there. I can't stop that. But I can stop the easy path of them having a downloads button right here to download a whole bunch of content. I want to put a little bit of a barrier there. Personal preference, it's what I do. Of course, that's why it's an option, because you might not want to do it the same way, and that's perfectly fine. There's also a checkbox here to allow the clearing of the content cache. Now, we talked up here about the cache location and how it automatically cleans up after itself after a certain amount of time, in this case, 30 days. In fact, I'm going to set this back to 30 as well. But if you allow this clear content right here, the clear content cache actually is what this means, then what it does in the Hive space is it presents to the user on their user settings right here the ability to clear the cache. All right, that's all this does. Now, if I clear the cache manually, intentionally, it's going to clear up about 224 meg of total file space. All that means if I do this is the next time I go grab any piece of content out of Hive, since none of it's cached, it's going to take a little longer to get it the very first time. And that commonly used content will then build itself back up if I have cleared that cache out. But every once in a great while, something squirrely may have happened, and maybe I need to go in there and clear that out. So I allow this to be available. Most users don't pay attention to this anyway. So it's something that if I have this turned on, they can simply go in there and run this if I ask them to do a thing. Or you as admins, if you want to, you can go in there and do this. This checkbox here controls this setting for everybody across the organization, including admins. So if you uncheck this, you won't see it either. And I personally like to have this available to me, so I leave it checked. It doesn't hurt anything. It's not prominent. It's not in the user's face. It's up buried underneath their user settings. But that's what this checkbox here does. The other thing that's available here is the preview generation and the use of existing previews on content. These are some settings as admins you may want to change for yourself. This doesn't really affect the end user at all. This 100% affects you while you are processing content into Hive, especially as this content relates to Revit. The disable preview generation really is a Revit-centric setting here. When you're over on add content, there are some preview generation settings or content processing settings that you can control in Hive. And for these settings right here, there's Revit preview generation settings to kind of decide exactly how the previews will get built and what the appearance settings will be category by category and host type by host type. So you can create some of your own sub settings. Now we talk about this in detail in the session we've already done about content processing and these processor settings. So I would encourage you to go check that out. It's its own topic in detail that kind of talks about these settings in particular. But if you check this box here, disable automatic preview generation, then basically what you're doing is completely disabling the Revit preview generation settings here. It will exclusively use the preview that is on the family. It won't do any extra processing. It just uses what's already there. If the preview on the family is good, great. If the preview on the family isn't consistent and it's trash, well, that's the preview it's going to generate for what shows up in the Hive space. So I personally like to always use the processor settings here because I can guarantee if I'm processing something like a Revit door that's hosted in a wall, even if I forgot to change the preview graphics, this will 100% guarantee it's going to turn the wall off, turn off reference planes and dimensions, set it to an elevation view, change the graphic type to a rendered graphic type perhaps. All those things can already be preset so that I never have to remember about the family that's saved someplace. Or if I saved a family out of a project and it didn't have the right settings and I forgot to do it, then like my previews don't look great. I like to make sure they always look good, so I use these processor settings to control that. So I don't disable preview generation. I leave this unchecked because with it checked, it will use the preview in Revit. If I uncheck this, it will allow Hive to automatically generate its own preview based on the settings. Now, once you've processed content into the Hive space at some point, AutoCAD or Revit or any piece of content, it will have a preview of some kind. Now, you might be making additional changes to that content and reprocessing it. And when you reprocess it, by default, Hive is going to regenerate that preview and push that back up, and then that new preview shows up. Well, I have some customers who very commonly will take content that they've found, they will right-click it, and they will assign a custom preview image very intentionally, assigning a specific preview image. They're not even using what's coming out of Revit or AutoCAD or PDFs or whatever. They're putting their own preview image on something. And you can absolutely do that. But when you do that, the next time you process that same piece of content, what Hive normally will do probably is reset the preview to whatever it's pulling off that piece of content at the time. If it's Revit, it regenerates a preview. If it's PDFs, it'll reuse the icon from the PDF system. And so what some of my customers will do, if you're doing this step a lot as a manager, totally great, do it, have a good time with that, but you're probably going to want to disable Hive, replacing the preview that's there and just continuing to use the existing preview. Now understand, if you do this, that when you do make a change to a family that does not have a custom preview, Hive is still going to look at that and go, look, there's already an image up there, don't replace it. So you might not always see the most up-to-date graphics on something if you have this checked. You have to be a bit more micromanagey on your icons and tiles if you're doing that. So I do have some customers who will come in here and check this when they know they're about to process a bunch of content that has intentionally overridden previews, and then they will uncheck this when they're processing most everything else by default. So as admins, you have the ability to control this, and you can turn it off or on as you need. But again, these two settings don't really affect the end users other than the resulting preview image that they see when they search for content. This affects you while you're processing content up. By default, both of these are unchecked. By default, I'd probably leave them unchecked unless you have a really good reason to check them. The final option here is specifically related to AutoCAD and the content loading coming out of AutoCAD. Now, when you load a family or a block into the AutoCAD space, when you script or programmatically load something in, AutoCAD likes to yell at you and tell you that this particular block came from a library or a location on a system that it doesn't know about. Keep in mind, Hive caches content to this content cache folder. And so when you're inserting a block into your active drawing, if it came from a cloud-hosted library, then AutoCAD's not going to necessarily know about this content cache location. You will have had to go to the profile that's on the end user's computer and add the path for app data CTC Hive content cache. And many of us don't remember to do that. So this little checkbox right here, all this does is it suppresses that security dialog by very specifically taking whatever this path is that you've set and adding it as a support file search path in the AutoCAD space. And that really does save a lot of frustration from the end user's point of view and questions for you as CAD managers about how that block or where that block is coming from, and them asking like, why am I getting this error? They always call it an error, even though it's a warning, right? That's just how end users are. So you have control over this. If you don't want it to automatically do that, and you have maybe explicitly set a path in the profile, and maybe you point the cache location to that path, and for some reason, the path gets modified and you didn't know it, or somebody else modified it, and you want to like be aware if somebody's modifying that path, maybe you don't do this. But then the users will get that pop-up if this location changes and you haven't already added it to your AutoCAD profile. So personally, I like to make the user's experience streamlined. I suppress the dialogue and I make sure that it automatically loads that path. If you want more information about that, there's just a little button right here, a little info button you can mouse over, and it tells you exactly what I just said. But you can certainly read that for yourself later if you'd like. Okay, that's the major content settings here. The final settings are these library-specific settings. So in your organization, you have the ability by default to invite other companies, other users from other companies to use your libraries. You control who they are, you control what their level of access is, and you can remove their access whenever you want to, but you can share your libraries with other organizations. It's at the libraries level. In the libraries area here, you can go to the very final step, which is invite users. Well, if you decide for your firm, you know what, I will never do that. I don't ever want my managers to accidentally invite an outside user. You can turn off the ability to share or send an invitation to share to another organization, anybody who's not a part of your user team. So if you do this, then within the libraries area, that fourth step of inviting users will not appear. You can't even get to it. It just won't manifest in the libraries configuration. I do like being able to share with other organizations. There's plenty of times where I partner with other teams with my content, and so I want to be able to invite them to my library and let them use my content just like I use my content, so we can collaborate on the same projects. In the world of BIM 360 these days, we do that far more frequently. And so Hive has the ability to invite other organizations in and share my content with me. Now, they have to have a license of Hive. You have to have a license of Hive. Everybody has to have a license for this, but you can certainly still invite other organizations and people from other organizations to work with you on libraries. Now, the next setting here is one that for most firms, you'll probably have unchecked or leave unchecked. By default, this starts being not checked. This is the allow public libraries option here. What this does, this purpose of this is for manufacturers of content, building product manufacturers like the Titus or Price of the world, the Herman Millers, the, I don't know, American Foundry, who makes manhole covers, like all those different organizations that make products that we buy and use when we're constructing our building. Those companies may want to share their content through the Hive space. And so the allowing of the content to be publicly available is certainly an option you can turn on. Now, most of us in our organizations, we would not want any of our admins to accidentally take our corporate standard content and just willy-nilly share it with the world. So anybody who has a Hive account can actually connect to that library for free 100%. I have no control over who can connect to it. They can just go to public libraries just like you can and subscribe to my library. So by default, this is turned off for most organizations because you don't typically want to do that. As an architecture or engineering firm, you probably don't want your content shared worldwide, freely available to everyone. You've invested time in your content. You may want to invite specific discrete users of other firms to partner with you and use your content, but you don't want just anybody at XYZ architecture or design to go get your content and just use your stuff. So that's what these two checkboxes control. One is the ability to share your specific library publicly at all. If this is unchecked, you won't even see the option. Or the ability to invite other discrete users from other firms, again, turns off the option within libraries. The next two options here are kind of about Revit version filtering and how this works as it relates to library settings. So within Hive over here, in the, oops, I let it go to the background. Let me pin this to the foreground for a minute so I can resize this here. In the filters panel of Hive, there is an option to filter by a design app right here. That's what this auto filter for active design app is. If I happen to have Revit 2020 open with this checkbox checked, it would automatically set this Revit 2020 filter right here. And every single time I cleared my filters, it would continue to reset my active Revit version filter right there to be whatever my active Revit version design app was. This is very much a Revit-centric filtration here. I personally don't like this because I often have Revit content in older Revit versions that I want to use in my current Revit version. For example, all of my walls are in 2018. I have it processed into Hive, and when I grab that content, it does a quick one-time, like very short upgrade and loads it to my project. I don't even notice it. So if I had this set to explicitly show me Revit 2020 version content, I wouldn't see any of my walls by default, and I'd have to manually uncheck this. But then every time I hit clear settings, it would recheck this option. So for me, that's not a good option. If you have all of your Revit content in every Revit version year, then this might be a very good thing for you to have set to automatically default every time a user clears their settings to the Revit version that is their active Revit version year. And that can help minimize any issues for any content that might be outdated from older Revit versions that maybe still exists for older projects, but maybe isn't necessarily valid for your newer projects. So I have some customers who do leverage this. They really like this. I personally don't. I personally have this turned off. If you turn this on, there's a sub option here to auto update search results here. Let me let Hive go to the background. Automatically update search results to match the active design app. Now with this checked, if I have another version of Revit open and I switch to that Revit version, when this switches to say Revit 22 or 23 or 24, then it will also automatically change this filter and reapply the search results that I've got to rerun my search based on that version. Now for me, that drives me absolutely nuts. I don't like that, so I don't do that. But some customers, when they switch versions, they're so specific. I want this version content to be loaded into this version of Revit that as you switch design app, they want those search results to automatically refresh. So Hive will do that for you. All right, final option here, send an email notification when an external user is invited to a library. That ties in actually closely with this here. First of all, do you allow sharing? if you do allow sharing, when you invite an external user, do you want them to be notified that they've just been invited? Some of my customers do invite so rarely that they want that user to be notified by email. Some of my customers invite so many users, they just don't want them to be all notified with email blasts going out saying, what's going on here? Like, hey, how come I'm getting these emails? They have specific project kickoff meetings that tell them about the Hive library they've been invited to. So if that's how you work, you may not want to send the notification email. You have that control when you're inviting external users, whether those external users specifically are email notified that they've been invited to your library. You can turn that off or on, of course. Any future external invites, if you're doing external invites, will not send that email notification. Certainly, you could turn off both of these checkboxes, and it wouldn't matter if this was off or on, because if you can't even get to the area to invite, it doesn't matter if emails are being sent because you can't get there to even invite somebody. So it doesn't really matter. How do I recommend you have this set up? Well, personally, I set mine up exactly like this right here. If you want to screenshot this for your own personal settings, go for it. I like to notify, I like to enable requests, and I have it going to my Hive requests environment. I do have a cache location, the default locations, and I automatically delete both caches and logs after 30 days. Down below, I like letting my contributors comment and manipulate tagging, personal preference. I do allow cloud content caching. I prefer the cloud. I disallow downloading. I do allow my end users and myself, of course, to clear the cache. I do not disable preview generation. I love the fact that Hive does that for me. And I do not use the existing preview because I like my previews always being refreshed and up to date when I process new content. And especially if I change my mind on preview generation, when I reprocess that content, I want that new preview graphic. I do suppress the AutoCAD security dialog when I'm working with AutoCAD, which I've been doing a lot lately. I don't like getting that notification on new profiles that I've created if I've forgotten to add this cache path right here. I do allow sharing to outside organizations, but I do not allow my company to share public libraries because I don't want my content accidentally getting enabled for the world. Also, I do not automatically filter for the active design app. That drives me nuts personally, so I don't do it. My users in my firm kind of don't like it either, so we tend to not do this, but that might be a benefit for you. And I also do not auto-update search results because, again, that just makes my OCD go crazy, so I don't like when it does that. But you may want that for your organization. And then finally, if I am inviting outside users, I do like them to be notified by email. Ultimately, whatever my changes are that I've made inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and save that so that I lock those changes in. And the next time I open up the Hive CMS or any of my users open the Hive CMS, these settings will be in place and will take effect right away. All right, I'm going to say thank you. We always appreciate when you do show up live to our webinar and have a chance to interact with us. We do hope that we see you in future CTC webinars. You can find those on our events page of our website. We were just there a moment ago for the portal. You can go to ctcsoftware.com. On the top right is events, and you can see when we're doing future webinars like this one that go into detail about the CMS administration, about reporting administration, about all of our tools for that matter. So definitely take a look at the CTC website for those future events and get subscribed to those future webinars. With that, thank you all, and we hope you have a fantastic day.